Question from Patricia. I read that you started writing seriously after your 40s. Also that after becoming published, you set up a creative writing scholarship to enable working class creatives into the arts. Was a creative writing course your own way into serious writing? All strength to you and warmest wishes. So, short answer, no. My creative writing course at Oxford Books wasn't my way into serious writing. What it was a real indication to me that I wanted to write, that I was serious about writing. But I had been writing for a long time before that. And the only reason I did a creative writing course is because I was aware what I didn't know. And I did the course to learn the craft, to learn some of the terminology, and also to meet other people that you could spend 2 hours talking about a comma with. And that was always going to be on a creative writing course. So it's really good for me to do the course, but there are many other ways of learning the craft that don't involve spending £8,000, because that's how much creative writing courses are now, which I think is outrageous. When I did mine, I think it was £3,500, and that's bad enough. So if you've got the money, it's great. It's a really good way of learning the craft. If you haven't got the money, there's lots of free ways of learning how to do a creative writing course. For me, it was great, but it certainly wasn't the point at which I thought, oh, I'm serious about it. I already knew I was serious about it. / obsessed. Question 2 from Jackie. How can people get involved in your scholarship? So the scholarship is administered and the placement takes place at Birkbeck College in London. And I chose Birkbeck because it's one of the few universities that does a creative writing course in the evening only, so that you can work full time if necessary, because it's very difficult to do a creative writing master's and work at the same time, just the volume of work. So it's really good that they have acknowledged that a lot of people have to work and want to do the creative writing course. So if you go onto the Birkbeck College website and tune in, if you go to the Birkbeck College website and look for the humanities section, then the writing section, there's a long list of scholarships. There's many other scholarships apart from mine. I think there's 4 or 5 more. Mine is for all of the fees to be paid. Some of them are 10% of the fees or a quarter of the fees. But if you just log on to their website, you'll see all the details there. You have to apply to do the masters anyway. And then at the end, there's a question, something like, do you need a scholarship to continue with your application? And you just tick yes. And then the rest is straightforward. They'll get in touch with you. Question 3 from Wendy. How old were you when you first became aware of class or class? And was it something specific that sparked the awareness? So that's a really interesting question. When I was about 5 or 6, there was a family that lived down the road, only 3 or 4 doors away. And they used to say that we could go round. There's 5 of us. There were 2 of them, 2 girls, Ruth and Judith. They were really lovely. And they said, come round once every few weeks and you can have the comics that they had when we finished with them. Because it sounds very condescending now, but actually at the time it was just a lovely gesture because we were very poor and they weren't. So it was my turn, and I think I must have been 8 or 9. And I went round to collect the comics, and it was quite a thick bundle of comics. Back in the day, there was the Jackie, the Beano, there was one called Mandy. There was 5 or 6 comics, and they had them all. And so I had to wait while they got the comics together. And while I was waiting, I noticed that the table was set for what I thought was a party. So I thought it was somebody's birthday, because it had little fairy cakes and it had little sandwiches and it had orange squash. And I thought, oh, it's birthday, because we didn't have birthdays because I was Jehovah's Witness. So I went home and I said to Mum, oh, Mum, it was their birthday and they had cakes and they had sandwiches. And she said, no, That's just normal. That's a normal tea for somebody. And I was shocked. We never ate like that. We would never have cakes. And that's the first time I realised that people ate differently, because I hadn't been to anyone's house at that time. And that you could have cakes on a plate and a sandwich cut into triangles, and it wasn't a special occasion, and squash in a little tumbler. And I think that's the first time I realised that even though they probably were working class, don't get me wrong, they probably were a working class family, but we were way under being working class. We were, very different socially and economically. And then I went to a grammar school. There was a girl there called Terry Ann Coughlin, and she was bought a Mini for her 18th birthday. And I was like, I can't quite believe that anyone could have a car at 18. And I think my main understanding of class came when I started to work at the Crown Prosecution Service, and I began to work with people who had been to university, which was never on the agenda for me. Also, where I lived in Moseley, in Birmingham, there was a lot of students, a big student population, and a lot of the students were really intrigued by poverty. They quite liked saying, I've only got £1 to last me a week, because it was novel. And for us, having £1 to last a week was having £1 to last the week. There was no mummy and daddy to go and get extra from. And that annoyed me slightly. So I think that's when I became really super aware of class. But it's the beginning of quite a long journey, because I'm still fascinated by class. I'm still becoming aware more and more of the ways in which class impacts on people, and the differences between the classes, and also how that changes all the time. The boundaries between the working class and the middle class, and the middle class and the upper class, is completely fluid now and moves. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means it has a different impact, a different interpretation, and a different identity as time goes on. Good question, Wendy. Question 4 from Jeremy. In an interview, you say that the first book that you read of your own volition was Riotous Assembly by Tom Sharpe. What drew you to that book? I don't think it was the first book that I read of my own volition. It was certainly the first comedy that I read of my own volition. What drew me to that book? I cannot say. It was probably the cartoon on the front. Riotous Assembly, as far as I remember, is a book, a comedy set in South Africa, and it's completely non-PC. It really is quite terrible, but it's also very, very funny. In that sort of guilty way that, you shouldn't actually find that funny, but it is funny. I don't know if I find it funny now. I probably read that book in 1983. So whether it's funny or not now, I do remember sitting on a bus, and I read the sentence that said, "He now knew the face of madness." And I just let free with the laughing. I didn't even try and stop. I didn't even try and not, keep it quiet or titter. I was just like, brah. Everyone was looking at me. I didn't care. It was a great line. It's very funny, very, very funny book. Question 5 from Abby. I really loved The Trick to Time. Thank you, Abby. Did you set out to portray lots of different forms of grief? Do you think it's important for fiction to deal with stories of grief? I do think it's important for stories to deal with grief, because sometimes someone once told me that the point of fairy stories was to prepare your child for life. So you would tell children these bedtime stories like Hansel and Gretel or Snow White, and you were preparing your children by telling them these stories about what they would find out from the real world as you get older and you grow up and leave home, and you're going to encounter people that will trick you or whatever. And I think that fiction allows us to deal with things that we might have to deal with in the future, or enables us to deal with things that we might find difficult to explore in our own lives. For example, with The Trick to Time, there's a particular thing that happens to the main character, Mona, a very grievous thing, and she finds it very hard to deal with. And someone came up to me recently at an event and said that it's the first time they had read a portrayal of that tragedy, and it really touched them, and they were very grateful that someone was talking about this for the first time. So I think it's really important that books tackle difficult subjects. Grief is probably one of the most difficult subjects to write about. And did I set out to portray lots of different forms of grief? I can't sound that clever, really. I set out to try and write a really good book and to make sure people felt that after they'd paid $6.99 they didn't feel ripped off. And if I've talked about different forms of grief and been successful at all, I'm really, really glad. But I really just wanted to tell Mona's story and what had happened to her. And yes, there's lots of different ways that she's experienced grief, and lots of other people in the book. So thank you, very good question. Question 6 from Marissa. In The Trick to Time, Mona confronts turning 60. How do you feel about your own age, and how do you anticipate ageing will influence you as a writer? Well, fortunately, I'm extremely juvenile, so I might age, but in my heart, I will remain a teenager, I hope, for a long time. When I first started writing Mona at 60, it was really strange because I wrote about her as sort of this beige person with polyester, clothes and a hair set and a hairnet and an umbrella and a sad coat. And I thought, well, she's 60, that's how they dress when they're 60. And then I was 57 at the time, and I thought, hang on a minute, that's only 3 years away from me. And I really had to recalibrate. I really had to think, she won't be like that at all. 60 is not 60. 60 is much more like 40. When I was a young girl, my relatives that were 60 were literally ancient, just really old and out of it, or maybe it's my perception, but whatever. Anyway, 60 was a different thing 40 years ago. Now 60 is, relevant and vibrant, and 60 is an age at which you can start a new career. So I had to do some thinking. I had to do some rethinking about who Mona was and what 60 is in 2018 to what is 60 in 2020. And it's a very different thing from what it was years ago. How do I feel about my own age? I really have never been so happy, and I've never been so content, and I've never felt so fully myself, so that I used to worry about whether people liked me or what people thought of me. I don't do that anymore. This is who I am. And if you like me, that's absolutely wonderful. And if you don't, that's also wonderful. But it doesn't affect me either way. Very, very happy with my age. Don't really understand people that shave 10 years off their age or lie about their age. Like on dating sites, and you'll see people, ask me how I know about dating sites. You'll see people that say, 35, and you just think, but you're so not 35. You're 50. Why have you said that? Because it's supposed to be, better to be 35 than 50. I disagree with that. I love being my age. I think it's great. I'm nearly 60. Question 7 from Richard. Was My Name is Leon shaped by your experiences working for social services? Yes, absolutely it was. I worked for about 2 years for a charity that looked at mixed-race children in care, and I worked for quite a few years for social services, training social workers and foster carers about what it is to look after black children, mixed-race children, asylum-seeking children. And I also sat on adoption panels. And adoption panels is the body of people that decides which children need to be adopted and which adopters can adopt those children. And being on the adoption panel means you read a lot of case histories of how people came to be in care, and also of the parents and how the parents came to give up their children or have their children taken away. And it's heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And I would have been one of the people that made the decision in My Name is Leon to separate siblings, which is an ugly and horrible thing to do. And I've had to do it, and I've had to vote for doing that and approve doing that for the sake of the children or for the sake of one child. And it's not something I would ever want to do, and not something I'm content with, really. The reason you do it is because of there's so few adopters coming forward for mixed race children, but sometimes it just has to happen. And it has very often the consequence that one or both of the children can be very unhappy, as Leon was with losing his sibling. So I think part of My Name is Leon is my way of saying sorry, even though there's no alternative. It's still not a nice thing to do to siblings. And if there's any way around not doing it, then we would always take that. Question from Joe, question 8. What was it like to have Lenny Henry narrate the audiobook of My Name is Leon? So fantastic. So I asked for Lenny Henry to narrate the book and got Lenny Henry, which was fabulous. And on the day he was recording it, I went down to the studios and sat in a room where I could hear him, but I couldn't see him. And he was reading a passage in the book that, you know, it was a pretty ordinary passage where Leon's going to see his mother at a family centre after being separated from her for a long time. And I was as moved by that passage as though I'd never heard it before, because he read it so well. And I was sitting there going, oh, this is terrible. What have I done? What have I written? It was really moving, and it was fabulous to hear him do it. He was the perfect narrator. I could not have picked anyone better. And afterwards, he bought the rights to the book to make it into a TV film. So I think he liked it too. Question 9 from Andrew. Do you get to choose the narrators for your audiobooks, or have you any influence over who it is? If so, what do you look for? Well, that's interesting, because the first one, as I've just answered, was Lenny Henry for My Name is Leon, who I chose. And for The Trick to Time, I also chose Fiona Shaw, who narrated that book. And I chose her because she, apart from being a fabulous actress, she had the right accent and she had the right amount of sorrow in her voice. And I knew she would do those very difficult passages very, very well. And she did. She's fantastic. And what I was looking for in both of them was some kind of match to the image I had in my head, and also some kind of emotional match to the feeling of the text. And it's very hard to put into words. I don't know if anyone's ever listened to an audiobook and you've just thought, no, that is not working for me. You know, you've just thought, that's what the book's like, and then they've chosen somebody to read it. Or sometimes you think the book's going to be narrated by a man and a woman narrates it, and you're just thinking, it doesn't work at all. And these two were the perfect match, absolutely perfect. So, I think it's more of an emotional connection, or what I suspect will be an emotional connection to the text. Question 10 from Ellie. I'm looking forward to the anthology Common People. What do you think makes writing from working class authors different? What can publishers and agents do to make sure that publishing becomes more representative? So the first part, what do I think makes writing from working class authors different? Someone once described working class writing as the difference between classical music and jazz. And classical music is very beautiful and thought out and measured and cerebral. And jazz or rock and roll or reggae comes from a different place. It comes from the gut. And that's the difference between some classical writing and some middle class writing and working class writing. And not always, but sometimes working class writers write from the gut, or they write about the guts. They write about some kind of visceral experience. And it's not more valid and it's not better. It's just very different from other types of writing. And you recognise it if you're from a working class background. When you read another working class writer's writing, if they're writing about their experience, you recognise that quality in it that is stripped back and bare and real. And the other side of the coin is that working class writers also need to have the opportunity to write about whatever they want to write about. Often people think, well, working class writers are going to write about working class issues. So working class writers are going to write about what it is to be poor, what it is to be unemployed, what it is to be on the streets. But actually working class writers can write exactly what they want to write. So if they want to write about Tudor times, if they want to write about Vikings, if they want to write a historical romance, they can also write that. But what they pour into it is their experience of being working class, which is very real and very much from the heart. So working class writers don't have to always write about their experience. And until we have the freedom to do that, we won't have equality, because middle class writers can write about whatever they want. They don't have to constantly regurgitate their own experience. And neither do working class writers. We can write and say whatever it is we want. Question 11 from Louise. How important do you think the art of oral storytelling is? When you write, do you imagine how the story would sound read out loud? So, oral storytelling is the most important form of storytelling, way more important than the written word as far as I'm concerned. It's the first way that we told stories to each other, and it's the way we still tell stories to each other. Even if you go to the hairdressers and they say, did you have a good holiday? We tell a story. We don't say, yeah, it was great, thanks. You say, well, we got to the airport and it was really packed, and then we got there and it was 26 degrees, and then we went and we sat by the pool, and on the third day, you're telling a story straight away. We're all storytellers. We tell stories all the time about our lives to one another. Everybody tells stories, and we tell stories all the time. And the formal oral storytelling that we still have in some tribal communities, and still have in Ireland, and we still have in the West Indies, and places that just really value oral storytelling. It is such an art, and it is so important, and it's so different to have, for example, in some communities, they have one story, and it's the same story, but different storytellers will tell it a different way. And in Ireland, there's a tradition that you'd have storytellers that went from pub to pub telling stories, and they'd get bought drinks all night, and they were really valued members of the community. And I think it's another thing about class, because we've only had universal education for everybody for the past 100 years or so. And before the working classes were able to read and write, their stories and other stories and humorous stories and entertainment was passed on orally. And it was very valued, and it was the way in which we would have our entertainment and the way we'd keep our traditions alive by telling them orally. So it's hugely important. And it's a way that we connect with one another, and it's a way that we develop our skills in communication and our human relationships. And when I write, the question is, do I imagine how the story would sound read aloud? Well, any writer will tell you that the best way of editing your work is to read it aloud. Because sometimes when you write and when you read, you skip passages because you think you know what they're going to say. And when you read out loud, you can't skip passages. And if you are skipping passages, probably because they're rubbish and you should delete them. So I do always wonder what my stories will sound like read out loud. And I recently had a short story that I wrote read out on Radio 4. It was called The Wedding Speech of Big Tom Fallon. And I wrote it about a man who lived in Cork in a village called Skibbereen. And I sent it to Radio 4 and I said, like, here's the story. Can you just make sure that the reader is from Ireland? That's the only thing. Otherwise, some of the references will be lost. But they actually found an actor from the town, tiny little town, that I'd mentioned. And so the accent was absolutely spot on. It was just a joy, absolute joy, to actually have my story come alive with the right voice and the right accents and the right feel. It was very beautiful. So it's a magical thing to hear your stories read out loud.